All right, here we go. Back in the book of 2 Timothy. It's my favorite book in the New Testament. If you have been here for the last 5 weeks, you know that we're just kind of marching through verse by verse through this book that we have in our Bibles called 2 Timothy. If you're checking us out for the first time, or you're just kind of now just jumping back in after a summer and early fall on the move, let me take 45 seconds and catch you up to speed and give you a context with which this was written. We're going to talk just for a second about who wrote it and why they wrote it and who they wrote it to, so that you understand the scope of the conversation that we're going to have today. So, Paul, first century missionary, 2,000 years ago, about age 30 or so, has an encounter with Jesus and becomes a Jesus follower. And from age 30 until over 60, he travels the world sharing the gospel, planting churches, but he doesn't do it alone. He does it with a team. And you might even be familiar with some of the names of the guys that were on his team, like Barnabas or Silas. But one of the people on the team was a younger man named Timothy. He's probably about 20 years younger than Paul. When Timothy was a teenager, we think, maybe 16 or 18 years old, Paul picked him up on one of his journeys and said, there's something about this guy. When he was in Timothy's town, the whole town said, there's something about this guy. He's different. He's special. God's hand is on him. And so Timothy joins Paul's team. One of the things that Paul writes about Timothy later is that he says, I have nobody else quite like Timothy. Paul never got married, never had kids, but he has in his own mind a spiritual son named Timothy. And so 2 Timothy is actually written when Paul was over 60 years old and in jail. And he knows that the end of his life is near. One commentary I read said that Paul knows that the fat lady is warming up her vocal cords and she is about to sing. The end is near for Paul. And he writes a letter to his spiritual son, Timothy, who is currently serving as a pastor at a very big church in a city called Ephesus. So that's the context for what we're reading. This is not just a 4-chapter book in the Bible. It's not how it started. It started as a letter from a man named Paul to his spiritual son, Timothy. We've made our way through chapter 1. We're in the early verses of chapter 2. If you don't own a Bible, I can see the stack of them right there on the table in the hallway, and we would love for you to snag one of those on your way out, and you can write your name on it with a permanent marker because it's yours. We would love for you to have it. In the early parts of chapter 2, Paul gives Timothy what I like to call discipleship in 3D. He gives him 3 images, pictures, illustrations of what it actually looks like and feels like to be a wholehearted, committed follower of Jesus. Last week we talked about this. We talked about how the first illustration was that Paul says, Timothy, you're like a soldier, and you're supposed to be a good soldier. He writes, join with me in suffering like a good soldier of Jesus Christ, Timothy. No one serving as a soldier gets entangled in civilian affairs, but rather tries to please his commanding officer. And so the conversation that we had about that was that good soldiers are quickly obedient to their commanding officer. They're single focused. They've got one objective in mind. There's no question what a soldier's trying to do when he's at work. And we talked about civilian affairs, or silly string, you might remember. And if you want to go back and listen to that, you certainly can do that wherever podcasts are found. If you want the full effect, YouTube is the way to go for the silly string part. But he doesn't stop at soldier. He actually goes on to give him 2 more pictures, illustrations of what it looks like to follow Jesus. This is what he writes in verses 5, 6, and 7. He says, similarly, Timothy, anyone who competes as an athlete does not receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules. The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Reflect on what I'm saying, Timothy, for the Lord will give you insight into all of this. It's almost like Paul was writing and getting ahead of himself and thinking of all these images. You're like a soldier, you're like an athlete, you're like a farmer, and he almost acknowledges, I'm kind of all over the place here. Timothy, you're going to need to stop and reflect on all of this so that God can help you understand what I'm saying. As I read these, I too need the Lord to help give me some understanding so that I could fully understand what Paul's trying to tell Timothy and what God's trying to tell me through this passage too. So first, let's talk about the athlete. What does Paul mean when he says, similarly, anyone who competes as an athlete doesn't receive the victor's crown except by competing according to the rules? When you were a kid, I personally would have never done this, but did you ever cheat in sports? Did you ever play flag football? I would have never considered doing anything like this. But did you ever, as a kid, when you didn't have flags, we would just get the longest pair of socks we owned to play flag football, and we'd tuck them in our shorts? Personally, this would have never crossed my mind, but I had friends that would tuck them way down in the side so that just the toe part was like hanging out. And then if we actually had the luxury of flags, once again, this would have never crossed my mind. But after you put the belt on, I would have friends who would tie the flag like around their belt a few times so it was just sticking out just a little bit. And if somebody would come and almost try to grab onto the flag as you're playing, once again, this isn't really me, but they would just kind of swipe their hand, you know what I mean? These are ways to cheat as a kid. And somewhere along the lines, somebody told you, and if they didn't, I should remind you, cheaters never win. Because if I say the name Lance Armstrong, or if I say Marion Jones, or if I say, I'm sorry, JJ, the Houston Astros, or if I say Mark McGuire, or if I say Sammy Sosa, you go, it wasn't legit. Cheaters never win. Have you ever heard of Sergio Matsanang? You ever heard of this guy? Sergio Matsanang, 10 years ago, he's a South African runner, signs up for the Comrades Marathon in South Africa. It's not 26 miles, it's 56 miles. 56-mile race. That's a long way to run. So Sergio concocts this devious plan. He starts the race. There's cash prize here. So this is legit. These are for people competing for money. Sergio is running along in the race, and a few miles into the race, he jumps into a porta potty. And in the porta potty is his twin brother named Fika. And Fika's wearing the same hat, same shirt, same shorts, same shoes. And Fika jumps out of the porta potty and begins the next leg of the race. And they mapped it out so that 4 or 5 or 6 times along the route, they would swap in a porta potty. And they went on to finish in 8th place and win $1,000 in the Comrades Marathon. A few months later, race officials discover that Sergio's watch seems to be switching hands throughout the race. Every couple miles, in the pictures of Sergio, it's on his right hand and then it's on his left hand. And there's a shin on Sergio's, a scar, on his shin that seems to disappear during parts of the race. And of course, they're exposed that it wasn't Sergio the whole time. It was him and his twin brother back and forth, back and forth. They're cheaters. They never win. They're not allowed to race anymore in the country of South Africa because cheaters never win. And you and I, when we read that verse at first, when it doesn't implicate us at all, we agree. An athlete does not receive the victor's crown unless he competes according to the rules. Imagine watching the Olympics this summer, 400 meters, 1 lap around the track. The camera pans out and you see one of the runners just hauling it across the middle infield, and they cut 200 yards off the race and they finish 25 seconds ahead of everybody else. And then imagine how you would feel inside if that person was on top of the podium and their national anthem is being sung and their flag is being raised and the tears start coming down their cheek, so proud to be the winner. There would be international uproar over something like this because we agree. An athlete that does not compete according to the rules, well, there's no victor's crown for them. Cheaters never win. We agree when it's about other people. But here's what makes us bristle up a little bit. For the Christian, aiming to live a life that pleases God and blesses others, these are the rules. And we don't like the word rules. We would much prefer suggestions. But these are the rules. So that would mean that if you're not a Christian, if you have not made a decision to follow Jesus, these are not the rules for you. These, you're happy to read this and apply this to your life if you like. I think it will work out well for you. This is wisdom on how to live a life that is well lived, but it's just not required. But that would also imply that if you're a person that says, I am a Jesus follower, I've put my faith in him, well, then these are the rules. And before we keep going on this, I have to acknowledge that this is a dangerous conversation to have when you can't interact back much with me. When I'm just kind of giving a speech, this is dangerous. We've got to be careful here. A quick and sloppy interpretation of this verse might lead us to believe that somehow we get our salvation by following the rules. But that is not true. That is not what the Bible says, and the Bible is clear that this is not how it works. The law of God is not here as a mechanism for salvation, but the law of God is here in order to guide the conduct of a Christian. So rewind with me for a minute. Let's go back to Moses in the book of Exodus. Let's go back to the Passover. And if you're not familiar with this part of the Bible, that's okay. I'll do my best to try to explain what happened. If you remember, the Israelites are in slavery in Egypt. God's people, bondage. And God intervenes. He provides. He sends an angel, and the angel passes over their homes. This is the night that he sets them free. He passes over their homes. Why? On the basis of the sacrifice of the lamb. And what he does is he comes in and he redeems them with an outstretched arm, and he frees them from bondage in Egypt. He takes them from this place of slavery and moves them out and gives them freedom, and then he gives them the rules. Are you tracking with me? Do you catch the order of these two things? If we're not careful, in an earn-it American culture, we mix those back, we mix those up. We switch them. He doesn't give them the rules as a mechanism for getting out. He gets them out, and then he gives them the rules, and that's how it works. God provides us with salvation and freedom through Jesus, and then he gives us the rules so that we can know what to do and how to live. And I wonder if we have given this enough thought. I wonder if we have considered the necessary discipline it will take if we're going to be athletes that compete according to the rules. I made a list of things that I think that we should consider. Like, if we're going to try to compete according to the rules, forgive at the level that this tells us to forgive, to reject covetousness, like this says, to reject covetousness, to give and to be generous at the level that this says to give, to be honest, like this tells us to be honest, to resolve conflict with those that we are feeling a strained relationship with, to do that like this tells us to use speech like this tells us to use speech, to flee sexual immorality like this tells us to flee from sexual immorality. I have an observation, and I haven't been a pastor long enough to have that many observations yet. I still feel like I'm in the first quarter, perhaps, of this journey as a pastor, as I interact with people, but also just observe culture and society and see how people are moving. So I don't like to throw out my observations that often, or certainly I don't like to throw them out flippantly, but I do have an observation to share with you as it relates to these rules and our obedience to them, and I think perhaps you'll share my concern. Imagine the Christian life as a race. Imagine the Christian life as a race, and it's an out and back race. So there's actually just one road, and there's a line of orange cones right down the middle. And so as we go out, we go on the right-hand side, and then at the very end, there's a big sign that has an arrow that says turn around. And we get to the end, and then we run down the same road just on the other side back to the finish line, which is actually the same place as the starting line. You catch what I'm saying? It's an out and back kind of race. Imagine this Christian life as this race. We're these athletes, we're running in the race, and we're all trekking down the right-hand side. But as the race goes on, we notice that there are some other runners who don't go to the end, but who instead just hop over, and they cut the corner, and they begin to start coming back the other way. And it, for a second, looks like they are really cruising. But there seems to be no consequence for this cutting of corners. And so you just keep running, and then more and more people just keep jumping over. And they jump over. And there's no race officials out there to flag them down. They're just cruising back. There seems to be no consequences so far. So it gets to the point where you're trying to do this thing right, and you run down the right side of the road, but it gets to the point where it's like you're one of the only ones. You're the last one running the originally intended route that was set before you. But you get to the point where you go, there's nobody even out here. Everybody else already crossed the line and cheated, and so you jump over the line as well, and you start making your way back to the finish line. You didn't get to the end either. Are you qualified to win that race? Because you ran further than everybody else and did better than them, should you receive the victor's crown, if you will? Did you compete according to the rules? The concern I have, the observation that I have made, I guess, is that I just see that God's enemy's most effective strategy, one of his most effective strategies, is to get us thinking that we are wholeheartedly following Jesus as long as we can find some people that aren't following Jesus as well as us. As long as we're doing a little bit better than some other people, that's really all that God is looking for from us. You and I both know that if we go down this rabbit hole long enough, and if that's the standard that we're working with, as long as we're doing better than some other people, man, it's so easy. We can always find somebody doing worse than us. And when we're confronted with the fact that pieces of our lives do not line up with the Bible, God's way to live our lives, and we respond with, well, it's what everybody else does, or at least we're not doing that, and we point to something worse, we're essentially saying that the holy life that God has called us to, a wholehearted devotion to Him, is simply just to be a little bit better than the people around us. But that isn't the standard that God is calling us to. It's not compared to others. That's not the standard we're supposed to be working with. An athlete does not receive the victor's crown unless he competes according to the rules. And this is important for us to understand. This is not a law. Friends, this is not a law that brings bondage. James writes, this is actually a perfect law that brings freedom. When we start hearing the word rules, we start to think that God is holding us back. The only thing that the law holds us back from is destroying ourselves and the people around us. There's a way that seems right to man, our ideas on how to do it. And in the end, it leads to death. That's what it says. And Jesus came and said, I've come so that you may have life and life to the full. And see, again, this comes down not to whether we know this or not, or whether or not we're courageous enough to try it. It really comes down to our faith and our theology. What do we think about God? Is he out to rip us off, or is he out to set us free? Is his way the best way, or is it the boring way? And you'll never find out unless you try it God's way. Unless you send it and say, I'm doing it his way. We don't find out on this side the thrill of obedience when we walk in his ways. Let me just read for you wonderfully written comments from Dale Ralph Davis, who writes about 2 Timothy much better than I do. He says, I know some Christians have allergic reactions when they're told they're subject to God's moral law. That's the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. This they fear is legalism and an effort at salvation by works. But that fear misunderstands the function of the 10 Commandments. The law comes in the context of grace. Yahweh, this is so good. Yahweh lays down the pattern in Exodus. He delivers his people, and then he demands. He works his redemption before he sets down his requirements. He first sets Israel free, and then tells them how that freedom is to be enjoyed and maintained. Listen to that again. He first sets Israel free, and then tells them how that freedom is to be enjoyed and maintained. Glad obedience to God's moral law is simply our logical act of worship. Glad obedience to God's law is an act of worship. I'm going to pivot just as fast as Paul did. The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive his share of the crops. What's he going on about here? This is what you need to know about farmers. This is what Paul's trying to tell Timothy. Farmers do the right things over and over and over when no one notices, no one cheers, and no one cares. They are diligent, they are patient, they understand that some stuff is going on underneath the surface that cannot be seen quite yet. To an onlooker, a farmer looks like they are playing in the dirt. But the farmer knows that something's going on, and so they till the soil and they plant the seed and they water it. They trust that something's going on that they can't see yet, and they trust that one day there will be fruit, there will be harvest, but growth takes time. Paul says to Timothy, not only are you a farmer, but you're a hard-working farmer. There are no big drone-controlled farming machines here. I mean, farming in the first century is get out there and hopefully you have a cow. If not, you got to do it yourself. This is hard work, Timothy. That's what it takes to see fruit. This is not easy. We've talked about this for the last 3 or 4 weeks, that this Christian life is not a walk in the park. And I apologize if I made it seem that way. Let me just share something with you kind of as we close here. It's very important, especially if you're listening to this, if you read this and you're interested in being obedient. If you're wanting to be somebody who shows their wholehearted devotion by competing according to the rules, if that is of interest to you, if you read the Bible and are humble enough to acknowledge that there is a gap between your conduct and the way that God wants you to live, I mean, that's got to be true of all of us. And if you're interested in actually changing, in reading this and saying, God's way is better than my way, I'm going to operate differently. That might be a very big deal for you. It probably is a very big deal for you to make a change like that in your life. These are not simple things. They're challenging things, and it might be a big deal to you. But I just got to warn you, I don't think anybody's going to care. I don't know if anyone's going to notice. That's what it feels like sometimes to be a farmer. Let me give you a few examples of how this might flesh itself out. Let's imagine that you're at your place of work. There's a culture there where people are cutting corners. People are being lied to, whether it's the government or customers. And there's just some dishonesty. And you know it. And you've been a part of it. And you come into work this week or next week or in the coming weeks and you say, hey, I feel like we got to stop doing that. We got to stop cutting corners. We need to pay the taxes that we're required to pay. We need to be more honest with our customers. We're lacking honesty. We're lacking integrity, and we need to do it right. You think they're going to be proud of you? You're more likely to get fired than promoted. You're in a relationship. You're not married, but you're in a relationship. You have a boyfriend, girlfriend, fiance, whatever, and you've just crossed lines physically. And you can point to people doing worse, but you know where you're at, that you've crossed lines, and you're going to go to that boyfriend or go to that girlfriend and say, hey, that's behind us. We're not doing that until we're married again. You think they're going to be proud of you? Hey, I know we moved in together. It's not God's design. I really feel like we should move out until we get married, and then we'll move back in together. Is that going to go good? That's not going to go good. You go to your spouse. You guys have been saving up for something really special. You've been saving for a while. You have been sacrificial to build this account, to buy this thing, to go on this trip, to do this one thing. And something between right now and that moment of getting it strikes you as something that you're called to be generous towards, whether it's something with My Village Ministries or a person that you meet or something that our church starts to do. Something just strikes you. And you go to your spouse and you say, what we have is not ours, it is God's. And we should do with it what God wants us to do with it. How do you think your spouse is going to take that? I'm just giving you these examples just to say like, hey, this is not going to be easy. To walk in obedience is not going to be easy, even to the people that love you the most. Especially the people that don't love you at all. You go out and hanging out with your girlfriends and everybody's dogging on their husbands. And you decide, your husband's not perfect, but you decide to highlight his character and the way that he honors you and your kids. You bring that up in that conversation, you expect them to clap for you? It's just going to be awkward. For you to reject gossip and gangrene style chatter and use words that lift up and honor your husband or your wife. I'm just giving you these examples because these are the kinds of things that are coming. You go to a bachelor party, bachelorette party weekend, everybody's getting a little tuned up, and you say water with a lemon, not because getting a beer is wrong, having it isn't wrong, but it having you is wrong. And you know for you that this is a thing. And so for you, you say, not for me. You think they're going to throw you a parade? It's not going to happen. Best case scenario, they ignore you. Likely, they're going to think you're an idiot. They're going to think you're on some kind of religious high horse, that you've changed. Sorry, I feel like maybe I should be more uplifting. The hardworking farmer should be the first to receive a share of the crops. Timothy, farmers do hard things. And they do them over and over and over. When the onlookers think that farmers are idiots, farmers know that fruit is coming. Farmers have no regrets in the end. Reflect on what I'm saying, for the Lord will give you insight into this. I feel like I need to do that. I feel like we need to do that. This has been a lot to digest in one short Sunday morning service. I know I'm over time. I have the time management skills of Will Howard up here right now, but let's do this as we close. That was dumb. Let's just create some space for God to do whatever He wants to do in us. Okay? I don't like to end messages with my to-do list for you. I like to end messages by creating space for God to speak to you. And so would you just do me a favor? Trust me here for a second. Let's just have a short conversation with God. Everybody gets to have their own one. I get to be the one who kind of MCs it. I get to ask some questions. And we're just going to give enough space between the questions for God to have some time to speak to you. Let's reflect, not rush. Thanks for watching. To find out more about our church, about when and where we meet, about joining a group, about serving on a team, about giving online, you can find all of it at threecreekschurch.com.